Welcome to Inside Asia, a podcast by SEB where we try to make sense and connect the dots of what's going on in Asian economies and financial markets. My name is Sean Yokota, Head of Markets for Asia at SEB. We are recording this on May 14th in the afternoon in Singapore. I'm joined by my fellow podcaster partner, Fredrik Hahnel, Head of Asia for SEB and General Manager in Singapore. Hey, Fredrik.
Hey, Sean. Great to be back and great to have Jens on the call this time.
Yes, that's right. So today we're delighted to have Jens Magnusson, SEB's chief economist. So Jens is responsible for SEB's overall economic and macro strategy research. And today we're going to talk about Japan since Jens and Fredrik, both of you, were just over in Japan this week. Hi, Jens.
Hi, Sean. Hi, Fredrik. Yeah, we were, and it's been a great trip. And I'm actually now in Singapore and visiting our office here. And yeah, it's exciting. It's a very vibrant place and quite spectacular too.
So as always, we start by talking about the recent developments in the Asian markets. And of course, the big news that came out this weekend was the China US tariff agreement, where China's tariffs were at 145%, but they came down to 30%. And then the imports from China from US was reduced from 125 to 10%. So it's a pretty big turnaround in the relationship. So let's just start with this. Fredrik, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I've concentrated on a little bit looking at what the reaction has been in China and the Chinese social media and Chinese media and among Chinese friends, and obviously this is seen as a big victory for China. It's been a lot of joking, a lot of humor actually in social media in China over the past few weeks on that the US in this discussion who will blink first, and everyone has been quite sure that the US will blink first. This will hit. U.S. consumers more strongly than this will hit China, and how could the U.S. possibly produce iPhones and other things? That's been a discussion. And I think now there's a relief, but there's also a self-confidence that is very obvious to Chinese people that the U.S. blink first. I think, and that it's it's portrayed as a humiliation for Trump and the U.S. to actually have to cave in so quickly, and that the Chinese are the greatest, which they arguably are the greatest negotiators around, and that they have done a very great job so far. So that's one reflection. I just came back from a client lunch where we discussed a little bit. This is a Nordic company doing business both in China and the rest of Asia. And they also we talked a little bit about this reaction in China to the to the deal between and the discussions between the U.S. and the U.K., where China is quite upset with the way the U.S. are putting pressure on the U.K. to screen and pre-approve Chinese investments into the U.K. and a lot of other details. So I think there's an expectation that that will be part of the the framework going forward, with a lot of pressure from the U.S. on other economies.
So China claims it as a victory for them.
I would say at least a temporary victory, and also huge expectations that after 90 days, of course, this will just be keep kept rolling, etc. So yeah.
How about you? Do you have any reactions, Jens, about this?
Regardless of who won, I think this is where we thought it would, or at least in the direction we thought it would go, meaning that tariffs would be cut. I mean, we got some pretty clear signals, especially from the US side, that these 145% are not sustainable and that it would come down. So we did expect this kind of movement, but maybe it was a little bit quicker than I thought, and maybe the drop in tariffs were a little bit larger than I thought as well. So quite significant and quite quick, I think. So, and overall, I mean, this is good news. I mean, this shows that also the White House administration is prepared to go quite far in order to roll back some of these tariff policies. On the downside, I think it's bad that we got another sort of pause. So this will be now for 90 days. Again, we already have another 90-day break or pause in tariffs. This means that sort of uncertainties will remain, and we still don't know what's going to happen in a couple of or 3 months time, and that of course is worse than if we had actually had a final agreement. But we'll take whatever we can get, and in this time we're happy that at least it moved clearly in the right direction.
The one thing I tell clients all the time is that I think the currency is still in effect in terms of the discussion. It's easier than trying to get a trade deal going. And yeah, whenever Scott Bessent says we did not talk about FX, that just gives me a good idea that they talked about FX. So I think that's what's coming on the cards. So, Fredrik, what were your two or three takeaways that you had from your Japan trip?
Quite positive. Japan has had with the weak yen and a boom in tourism, etc. Had quite a good ride after COVID in that sense. Actually, the GDP has been a little bit better than we were used to. You've had also a lot of Japan is quite well positioned in this geopolitical um, game field, so to speak, being an ally to the US and but still, having China as its biggest trading partner, a little bit in between, etc. So, but I think in general it was a lot of positive kind of feelings from this trip. A couple of things that came. There are so many things to summarize, and I look forward to Jan's input. But one is how central actually geopolitics is as a theme, as a discussion point in Japan. We met with Japanese ministers who came back from the US and had one of them had been directly engaged in these discussions with the US, and he mentioned how badly actually he thought that the US representatives had been prepared for this discussion. They didn't know exactly what the tariffs actually were when they negotiated with the Japanese, and they didn't really know what they wanted, etc. But at the same time, I think quite a high willingness to find a way forward with the US. The US is, after all, uh, they're an ally of the US, and Japan has the biggest number of US troops in the region. The US provides Japan with security, at least until now, very clearly. There was a lot of, I think, discussions on also, the tensions in the region more than I maybe am used to in discussions when I visit different countries in the region. There was someone who said that Asia is a region full of unresolved military conflicts. Technically, Japan and Russia is still at war after the World War II. I wasn't I wasn't aware of that. That's sort of technically still a fact. But you also have, of course, South Korea, North Korea, which is very close. You tend to forget that Korea is so close to Japan. So that's of course a constant risk zone. Taiwan, of course, being discussed quite a lot, and also as well as the South China Sea. So I think that came out as one big theme in all of this. That with a different geopolitical situation in the world, of course, Asia is pretty much at the center of that. For a country like Japan, and then I think it was also a lot of discussion on Japanese inventions and Japanese, the fact that Japan used to be a very innovative country, but ever since the Sony Walkman, I think was something people said all the time. What new has Japan come with in terms of inventions or innovations to the world? And why is that? Why isn't Japan more innovative today, while it used to be very innovative? I just, of course, demography will come back to, but I think I stop there and just let Jens come in.
So Jens, so what were your thoughts about Japan and the Trump and the tariffs and how they'll handle it, and maybe how they might handle it differently than how Europe might handle it or China might handle it?
First of all, Europe and China, they have handled it quite differently so far. China, obviously responding with quite high tariffs on that, following them all the way up to 125% in sort of hitting back with tariffs, while Europe so far has done close to nothing. I mean, some things, but Europe sort of paused when Trump paused his reciprocal tariffs. I think Japan's approach will be more like the European one, much more cautious, not as aggressive as China's, and certainly they want to make some sort of deal, and I guess they're quite hopeful that that will be achieved. I mean, adding to what Fredrik said, I was surprised how my impression is that they were not as concerned with the tariffs as I perhaps thought. Either because they didn't think it would matter that much, or because they are just convinced that they will be able to reach a deal. But either way, they seemed much more concerned with sort of the sense of losing the US as a reliable ally in geopolitical terms. Seems to be, to me at least, I got the impression that that was a bigger deal than the actual tariffs and the sort of potential trade war. So that was kind of interesting, I think. It's been relying, and I mean, obviously, exports to the US has been a big part of Japanese economy for quite some time, but it's even more important perhaps as a sort of ally in political terms, and the feeling that they can't really trust the US anymore, that was, I think, quite remarkable.
Yeah, I guess for Japan, since they've been through this before, about tariffs or trade deficits, so they moved a lot of production already to the U.S. So maybe, and then they moved the currency from 260 to 100 also at one time. I guess maybe they are a little bit more used to the economic side, but the geopolitics side, maybe this is the first time they're going through this.
Yeah, one thing that I thought we should add as well is that a completely different aspect of this is that Japan doesn't have much natural resources. It's a huge importer, and for example, when it comes to food, they import 60% of their food. So I think it's also a lot of that aspect for Japan security. How do you create resilience in this kind of development? How do you secure quite basic things for Japan in the future? That was also, I think, a reason for these discussions.
And kind of just moving along to related and brought up the geopolitics. So it's interesting, Jens, that you mentioned that the Japan is worried that U.S. may leave them alone. So if maybe China attacks Taiwan, that U.S. may not come to the rescue. I guess those are the kind of sense that you got.
Yeah, I mean, at least that was the underlying argument, I guess. We weren't perhaps that specific, but it was more like we have relied upon this, and it's been clearly a deal between Japan and the US ever since, I mean, since the last 80 years or so, that you know Japan should hold back on its own defense forces, and also in economic term being very much relying on the US, and but in that also it takes two to tango. So that means that they could also really rely on the political support if needed. And now all of a sudden it feels like maybe that is disappearing, or at least weakening, and that is seems to be very problematic. Then whether or not it's the biggest fear that what's going to happen in Taiwan, or if I mean the whole South China Sea is just full of conflicts, unresolved conflicts, with the Philippines, with Taiwan, with Vietnam. Almost every country has some sort of conflict going, and Japan is certainly not isolated from those. So they really need the U.S. in their corner, and now they doubt that they have that.
Japan, of course, relies heavily on trade in the region. So any tension that happens, it would be a collapse for the economy. But did they? Were there also talks about, well, they're increasing military spending, that maybe they have to defend on their own?
Yeah, I mean that's part of it, and of course I mean we're not going to go through all that, but the sort of last decades of Japanese economic history has been fascinating, as we know, with huge growth rates in the 50s and 60s, and continued strong growth in 70s and 80s, and then it all sort of collapsed in the late 80s and early 90s, and then you had more or less three lost decades of economic growth, or an economy without growth. And now they do seem to be picking up or normalizing, at least slightly. We don't have huge growth rates, but it looks better at least, and we have more normal levels of inflation and interest rates perhaps going forward. But it's still very uncertain where the Japanese economy is going, and thereby also the means they have to increase their spending on military. Yeah, that's the plan, absolutely, to try to rebuild their own forces, but we haven't really seen whether or not they can do it, and it's also a fine balancing in order to do that without creating even worse tensions in the region than there already is.
Yeah, that's actually a good point that you bring up, that the geopolitical situation that they're in now, it may be just a consequence of the economic situation, that it may be a little bit weaker geopolitically because Japanese economy hasn't done so well and they're kind of losing out in the global market share or the power that it used to have. Um, so kind of, yeah, leading to that. So did you get the sense that the economy is on a good footing? They're completely out of deflation, and of course the demographic issue isn't going to be a weight on the economy going forward.
Well, I mean, we heard all kinds of ideas in that respect. We heard the super optimists saying that, yes, we are now heading in the right direction. Japan will have 10 beautiful economic years ahead. Inflation is at a healthy sort of 1.5%, 2%, and it's going to stay there. Uh, at the same time, wages are moving up, creating sort of more demand in the population, and uh, demographics used to be a problem, but not really anymore, because now Japan is sort of letting in more migrants, and it's the scarcity is the invention of it's the mother of all inventions. So even though we have perhaps a slightly difficult demographic situation, that's just going to lead to more inventions and sort of better productivity. So that was the super optimistic side of it, but of course it's not all that rosy. You can certainly see a number of problems in the Japanese economy, and I think one of them will be demographics and sort of aging population and shrinking population. It's very hard to work around that, even with if you try to stay optimistic. But moving from some 123 million down to maybe 80 or 90 million in the next few decades, that it's tricky to produce a lot of growth during such a development. So I'm in between there. I'm not sure that we're out of the woods yet in terms of Japanese economics. What do you think, Sean?
Oh, I think Fredrik, you have some inputs in this. Why don't you start first?
Okay, thank you. I agree with everything Jens said. I think it was quite, now starting this into this year, I think that it was obvious that the economy was slowing down quite a bit here. A couple of reflections, though, on top of what Jens already mentioned. One is, yes, the labor force is decreasing because of the demographics, but there was also a lot of discussions on increasing women participation in the labor force that I found quite interesting as one way of addressing this problem. And I agree, there was more discussions on immigration than the last time we were there together, Jens, a few years ago. I think that was quite obvious. So that's definitely, Japan is opening up and it's changing. And another aspect of Japan changing is that, let me see here. I have my notes in front of me. I think if my notes are correct, someone said that 3.6 million companies exist in the US, in Japan, and out of those 3.46 have less than 300 employees. Regardless if those statistics are entirely correct or not, there's a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises in Japan now, and a lot of them you can see now how the first generation of the founders are retiring and getting older. So there's a lot of room. There's much more willingness today to actually sell off the businesses, and there's a huge consolidation. I think it's worth mentioning here, coming with acquisitions of smaller companies, and we also see, of course, a lot of the large private equity firms being very active and very optimistic about Japan. So that's a change I think coming. You mentioned. Um, the salary increases, I mean, they've been over 5%. I think the latest numbers I saw, that is definitely also a big change with inflation having come back somewhat in Japan. I think another positive was that and maybe one of the reasons they were not so worried about this trade conflict with the US per se, is that actually the Japanese economy is not that dependent on exports directly to the US at least. So that was maybe one of the reasons. That was not just a big thing, but yeah, I think other than that, I think Jens mentioned the main things here. What do you think, Sean? When you hear us, you are more an expert than Jens and I are.
Well, I think just for numbers purpose, so a developed country just growing on productivity should be 2% growth. And for Japan, because of the populations, it's shrinking about half a percentage point, and maybe it gets to 0.7%. So that's the headwind that it faces. So instead of growing 2%, Japan's always going to be a 1%, a little bit over 1%. So it's going to be growing half as fast as all the others because of demographics, which is tough. And I think the big test always for Japan is what happens when US goes into a recession. Can they withstand that and kind of stay out of deflation in the next recession? I think that's the main test. And then lastly, of course, I'm Japanese, and since I don't live in Japan, so that's my take on the future of Japan. I live in Singapore right now because I think that's where it's more vibrant. It also helps that my wife's Korean, so we got to stay in neutral countries. We can't go to Japan right now. But yeah, the day I move to Japan, I think is when I think this deflation thing is over. But so, not yet. I'm not sold yet.
One thing you can just add to the sort of your argument about the shrinking population negatively contributing to growth rates is that uh, just stating the obvious, but it helps in terms of sort of keeping the standard of living, even though the growth rate is slower in terms of per capita growth. I mean, obviously, you don't need as much growth if you're a shrinking population as if you are an increasing population. So yes, Japan will probably have a lower sort of potential growth, but it will also need less growth in order to maintain the standard of living for the population. So those two go hand in hand. But yeah, when we compare countries, we typically don't compare per capita growth. We compare sort of overall growth, and that then Japan will lag slightly.
Yes, yeah, you're absolutely right. So for per capita, Japan's been growing in income terms, even though they've been in deflation all these years. Then let's move to one more topic, which is related to this. So I guess you are with some customers in Japan. Um, were they optimistic about Japan, and are they thinking about investing more in Japan? What were the good things and the or things holding them back, or is this the tech, the AI things? Are they really coming back? Is there a new Sony Walkman coming back that we don't know of?
Well, I don't know if you could summarize it by the clients being optimistic or pessimistic about Japan, but they were certainly curious about Japan. I think it has almost been a little bit in the shadow now, obviously from China, but perhaps also from Southeast Asia with Vietnam and India and sort of a few countries that seem to be more moving faster right now. But I do think that Japan is getting back slightly into focus, and that I guess is what also brought us there. Uh, there is certainly a bit of a sort of startup and IT and AI scene also in Tokyo. And we did hear the argument that in some respects it's actually more attractive to be there than in, for example, Silicon Valley. It is possible to raise capital. It's not as easy perhaps as in California, but it's possible. And you don't have to come the fierce competition that you have in Silicon Valley. You don't see sort of people changing jobs every 10 months, and you don't have to pay them double what they had last time every time they're changing jobs. So we did hear some arguments that it's actually a very good startup scene in Tokyo. And then but it's obviously also clearly that they so far have not produced that many sort of unicorns or great examples of fantastic startups in the AI area that for example the Silicon Valley has. So I guess it was a mixed picture there.
I think historically, not for startups, but for the bigger companies, the biggest thing foreign investors were a little bit skeptical about was the corporate governance part on do they really care about the share price, or do they really have independent directors, or They just have people in management that's been in the companies for years to make it last as long as possible. So I think that's still an area that it can be worked on, and to kind of get this Japan's mojo back in the private corporate sector.
One of the prejudice that I think many Swedish companies and perhaps international sort of watchers of Japan and Japanese corporate life is that you start in a company, you work there forever, you never change jobs, and the job security is everything. That seems to be something that is now clearly also changing, and we got a lot of reports on actually especially younger people moving quite rapidly, and they want to be in these more sort of dynamic sectors rather than just join a big company and stay there forever. And we heard that there's also now a big payback in terms of salary increases when you move, and we see in Tokyo that you, on average, if you're in your 20s and move jobs, there's a sort of wage benefit of about 40% on average for those people changing jobs. So it's much more common than it used to be. So I guess that is also something that is perhaps changing in Japanese work life. You don't necessarily stay with the same employer for your entire career.
Yeah, so you're right, because I was there 3 4 months ago, and when you're on the subway, there's so many ads on the subway about HR agencies for you to switch jobs. Same with like if I get on a taxi, there's always a screen kind of running advertisements, and it's usually about companies that help you change jobs. So it's definitely a hot topic, and yeah, something that makes the labor market a little bit more flexible and more dynamic going forward. So before we wrap it up, is there anything else that you want to mention that we haven't talked about yet that stood out from your trip?
I mean, for me, as I have a background from the Swedish Ministry of Finance, I spent a lot of time there, a few years, on the Swedish pension reform. So this whole idea about sort of aging population and the demographics is just extremely interesting. And I think it's, I mean, in terms of fertility rates, birth rates, we're down to 1.2 child per woman in Japan. I mean, most of also Europe face the same problems, albeit perhaps not at those low levels, but it's just over half of what you need in order to sustain the population size. So you need 2.1%. Japan is now at 1.2. Think it's very interesting what they're trying to do to help this, and they have doing parental leave and some benefits, paternity and maternity leaves, which they're trying to address the problem. What they haven't done so far really is reforming the pension system, and that is something that Japan will very much need to focus on, and that is something that I will pay a lot of attention to, because that must be one of the bigger challenges that you have in the sort of economic political world going forward.
Yeah, building on what Jens just said about the demographics, if you look at the development over time here, Japan does have around, what can it be, 125 million inhabitants today, I think, or roughly thereabouts. And according to projections, that will go from 125 to 87 million in 2070. And so, if that plays out, of course, coming back to your question, Sean, is this an exciting market for companies to bet on? Obviously, with these growth rates and with that kind of development going forward, there are for many companies limited growth opportunities, at least. And Japan is not the manufacturing market for sales in the regions that's sort of since many years today. So I think it was more a lot of interest about the like said, the whole, where is Japan heading, Japan's ambitions within artificial intelligence. I found that discussion very interesting. They have very high ambitions, and with SoftBank and other companies, they are very successful. So I think there's a lot there to follow. And then finally, I think that something that wasn't actually discussed so much, but is still worth keeping an eye on is, of course, the whole yen carry trade, with Japan having had zero interest rates for so many, I mean, decades, and the rest of the world have had some pickup. And we've seen that. We can also see that in financial markets, in our business, that there's been a lot of capital flowing out of Japan to seek return in other countries. And when I mean, we saw a little bit recently last year when that kind of reversed a little bit what happened in financial markets. But the question is, of course, what happens if we would see even more increases in Japanese rates and lower rates abroad? How would that affect markets in general? That remains to be seen. But yeah, those were two reflections.
Yeah, and to add to that sort of macroeconomic point, we also have the fascinating debt situation in Japan. I mean, how long can you keep well above 200% of debt to GDP ratio without it making it or it becoming a too big of a concern? We are concerned with many other countries that have about half of that debt to GDP ratio, but then again, it's of course a few characteristics that are typically for the Japanese debt. It's domestically held, and I think more than half of it is held by the Bank of Japan. So maybe it is a different dynamics than in most other countries. But nevertheless, it's interesting, and especially if interest rates are moving up, how will that impact public finances? Fredrik, you had a really sort of it sounded like a bit of a pessimistic outlook there in terms of the demographics. We should perhaps mention on a more positive note that yes, the labor force as such is shrinking, but the labor force participation rate has actually come up. So employment has come up in the last few years with the improved female work participation, but also people working in higher ages. So to some extent, you can balance that, not least with public policy suggestions. But of course, there's a limit to what you can do when the population is shrinking and aging.
When I talk about Japan, it usually becomes very negative. So let me just say something positive about this. But like you said, as it comes out of deflation and into deflation, one thing we have had in Japan is that if you look at the savings in banks from households and corporates, that's been increasing all this time during deflation. Because as a person, the best thing to do is not to buy, because in a deflation, tomorrow everything is cheaper. So the best thing to do is wait and see. So that's why savings have been going up. But I think once you start to get into inflation, this dynamic should start to adjust and consumption comes back. Companies don't park their money in a bank and start to invest and do other things. So I think it could be a very powerful comeback once Japan steps back into inflation.
It actually is a discussion that reminds us a lot about the European discussion. I mean, here we have the idea now that people need to save less on their bank accounts or in their mattresses and in their homes and start to invest more in the stock markets. And we have exactly the same discussion in Japan, that people have been so used to saving without really going for a return on their savings. But now, especially when inflation is coming back, not to high levels, but at least it's coming back into the economy. And then you need to get that extra return, and you need to get people to invest a bit more. You have to get used to investing in the stock markets and in mutual funds rather than just put the money in a bank account. And it will be interesting to see whether or not that succeeds going forward.
Yes, I think it's great if you can get the more the vibrant companies getting more capital than Japan's government getting money from savings to build up more debt. So it should create a dynamic, a cycling effect once
Yeah.
this really kicks in. Okay, we can go on forever on this topic, but let's try to wrap this up here. Uh, Jens, thank you very much for joining us. Hopefully, you can come back to us and talk about other things.
I will most certainly do so whenever I'm invited. It was great to be with you.
And finally, thanks everyone for listening to this Inside Asia podcast. Speak to you again.